Hello and thanks once again for taking the time to download and listen to our podcast from CelticUnderground.net. I'm Harry Brady, and this week we have a podcast with Jack Lyons where we analyse the good, the bad and the ugly of Celtic in the last few weeks or the last few games. We have the review of the 5-1 thumping of the new Rangers. We have a discussion around the 7-0 defeat in Barcelona, and then we have a chat about the Inverness Killie game. Now, this podcast was recorded prior to the Alloa game, but if you weren't at the Alloa game but you were at the Morton game, just imagine the Morton game where Morton don't score and we eventually score 2 at the end. It's the same thing. Anyway, before all of that we get into the chat of the podcast. Obviously there'll be podcast recommendations at the end, and there will be new music, or there is new music, as you'll be able to hear, from Paisley band called The Label on just now, and there'll be more about them at the end. But first up, before we get into Jack Lyons, here's Brendan Rodgers talking about the Alloa game as I record this last night. And then at the end of the podcast I'll also stick on James Forrest and Jack Cross.
There. How close is it that the players managed to find a way past and just get into that next round?
Yeah, the main objective tonight was to qualify. We always knew it was going to be a really tough game for us. I think if you look at Alloa in the group stages when they were coming through, they beat Inverness, they beat Ross County, teams that in the Premiership. So we knew they had great resilience in the team. We knew they had great mentality and character to want to defend. And they proved that. You know, we had a lot of chances in the first half, didn't take them, and of course when you don't take them, and as the game moves on, you can become a little bit edgy, but we showed great patience in the end. As I said, we scored 2 good goals. James and Mrs. finished, we got there in the end, and a clean sheet to go with it. So we're through, and that was the main objective of tonight.
What did you make of Craig Gordon's challenge?
Yeah, I was just asked that there in the telly, so I haven't seen it clearly again. I will need to take a rerun of that and look at it. I think the fourth official in the linesman was blocking me on the side, so it looked like we were having no issue and no problem. So I didn't know it was a bad challenge or not. So but I'll have a look at it and I'll let you know the next time we speak.
And what did you make of the goals?
Yeah, good finishes. Good finishes. James, he worked very hard all evening. Cuts inside and does a real good finish. And obviously the game stretched. Musa gets his goal again. Good bit of skill, cut inside and a wonderful finish. So, but give credit to Alloa as well. You know, this is a team that came here, and you know we've watched them. We've done all the work on them, so I know how resilient and how tough it was going to be for them. But to come here and play like they did and defend how they did was fantastic. So they deserve a huge amount of credit for coming and playing like they did. We deserve the credit for the patience to keep going and getting the result in the end. But performance-wise, we'll obviously play much better.
What did you say to the players at half-time? Because obviously 0-0, far from happy, I'm sure.
Yeah, no, I wasn't pleased at half-time at all. We have to be more clinical than that. You know, overall we created with 13 shots on target. You know, probably another 13 that weren't on target. So to score only the 2 goals was disappointing. You have to be more ruthless than that. I think it was the name of the game was about being patient. You know, if you move the ball quickly enough and you can open up the sides of the field, eventually the opportunities will come to you. But but we need it to be much better.
Brady, were you quite bemused by Joey Barton claiming in his book about Celtic's alleged interest in trying to sign him?
I haven't given it one second thought, really, to be honest.
Peter Joyce, obviously.
Yeah, I think he did. I certainly know. I never spoke to the agent, that's for sure. He didn't ring me. So, but no, I think everything's been said that's been said by the club, so there's nothing to add to it.
Brendan, can I just ask you about your initial impressions of Jozo Simonovic, just because this is really the first time that you've had a chance to see him?
He looks a top player in terms of, obviously, and I'm talking more in training than in the games, because obviously he only came into the game the other day in Inverness, and obviously the plan to try and get him game time tonight, get him through 60 to 70 minutes. But I think if you look at his profile, he's 6'3", he's very dominant, he's strong, he's quite conserve the ball, and for a young player he shows wonderful mentality from a really aggressive defence forward. So he's a player that I really, really like, and I think if you see him in training as well, he's very, very impressive. So hopefully he can stay fit and keep looking to make his way into the team.
Does he have a real chance, or do you think he's a real chance of being first team regular, isn't
he? Yeah, 150%. He's top player. He's a big talent. Obviously I hadn't seen so much of him, and then obviously he was injured, and then he was working towards getting back fit. But I can see why he'd be highly rated. I can see why a club like Napoli would want to take him, for example. He's got all the attributes in terms of to be a really top centre half. But now it's about availability and playing, and hopefully he can keep working his way to full fitness.
You were linked with a Brazilian defender.
So started already.
seems to. Greeny, anything.
Who?
I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, so
Is that why you're hiding behind the wall?
I'll spell it out there. It's just a short name. It's like G-R-I-M-I.
Okay. No, listen, I'm sure between now and the end of January it'll all start to come in, all the names. So there's no comment on it really. Good pronunciation.
Is Lee Griffiths in contention?
Yes.
Come back in for weekend?
Yeah, he's trained. It was just too early for him tonight. Monday, Tuesday he trained. He had a free day today. He trained Thursday, Friday, and he should be back hopefully in the squad, all being well, for Saturday. Which should be great news for us, because he's a real important player for us.
Chance of Rangers in the semi-finals, that's something you'd welcome?
Whoever. I think you just want to get into the semi-final. That's the main objective, and then whatever names are pulled out of the hat, that's who you take. So for us, we get to the semi-final, and whoever it comes, we want to get through to the final. And it was one of our, like I said, one of our targets this season was to get to the final and hopefully win a cup as well. So let's wait and see what we get.
Given what happened last time in the league, though, you certainly wouldn't feel it.
You're doing really well, eh?
Okay, thank you.
Scheming for a good night kiss, then you'll up and leave for the train. I wanna know just where you go. I wanna go, wanna throw myself into your arms. Just a suggestion, you might be the answer, but what's...
Hi, hope you enjoyed that chat from Brendan there. Sorry about the noise right at the beginning. There was somebody murdering a keyboard. Anyway, that was the Alloa game. There will be the James Forrest and Jack Ross interviews at the end of the podcast, along with podcast recommendations. Don't forget the Celtic FC Foundation work. There is the sleep out on November the 12th, and it is not too late to sign up for that, where you will sleep under the stars at Celtic Park, well, marginally under the roof of the main stand, and open out into the elements. Raising money for homeless charities. If you are doing that, it would be good if you could leave your sleeping bag behind, so get ready for that one. If you can sign up for that, that'd be fantastic. There will no doubt be the stuff that's coming up for Christmas with the foundation. as they're always doing, collection at Christmas time, bucket collection and a game before Christmas, and of course for delivering presents for families in need. There is the Girls for Good and various other things going on. Go on to the Celtic FC Foundation website. Anyway, enough of me. Back on to Jack Lyons and I discussing those games prior to the 3 games prior to the Alloa match. And I'll speak to you later. So I'm now joined by Jack Lyons. Jack, how are you doing?
I'm not too bad, how are you?
I'm excellent. Now, it's been remiss of me, the 2 times that you've been on, 2 times? 3 times? That you've been on before, I have not asked the one question that we ask everybody the first time they come on. So, here goes. Who was your first Celtic hero and what was your first Celtic game?
Well, my first Celtic game would have to be the very vague memory that I have of Tom Boyd's testimonial against Manchester United at Celtic Park. I couldn't really tell you anything about the game, but I remember I definitely met Hoopy the Huddle Hound. I must have been maybe 4. And that's about all I could tell you about the game. And then maybe after, I suppose you could say, the game after that the first game I really remember was a Boxing Day game against Livingston, where there was a power cut and the game never kicked off until an hour afterwards, and Nakamura scored a last minute winner.
Right.
I'm sure it was maybe 1-0 or 2-1, but he scored right at the end of the game. So that's the sort of games that the first one that I was really at, and the first one I can remember properly. As for probably anyone within about 5 years of my age, the first Celtic hero is probably the easiest one, which is Henrik Larsson. I think that kind of speaks for itself.
Yeah. Do you know, that's the thing about heroes. Because we've got St Anthony on the site, he's writing the book. I think he's just finishing off the book just now about Kenny Dalglish, and I saw him tweet the other day something about it's still even now when he thinks about Dalglish leaving Celtic, it's there's something a wee bit upsetting about it. I don't think I've ever felt like that. I mean, it's a shame he's going on, but there's no Celtic player that after he's gone, I've never sat thinking, I'm disappointed that he's still not there for emotional reasons other than because he makes the team better. How are you about the fact that Henrik's no longer at Celtic?
Well, I'm probably over it now, but I think I'm maybe similar to you in terms of, obviously, you get the main feeling of loss, if you like, when the player leaves is, the team was better when he was in it, or something to that effect. I can't say I've ever really had that real emotional thing. Maybe if I was a bit older, I would have just appreciated Larsson a bit more than I even did, because when he was at Celtic, I was kind of still quite young. Mm-hmm. So maybe it would have hit me harder if I'd been a bit older, but I can't say I've ever had that really with any player like similar to you in terms of an emotional attachment.
Anyway, that was just by the by. Just wondered if I was a bit odd by thinking that way. So since the last podcast, the last podcast that we did was with Hull Boy, and we previewed the game against the Rangers. And since then we've had win, loss, draw. So let's quickly try and go through all those games in order. So the first one is the win against Rangers. So I've seen you've done some blogging about the system of Rangers, system of Celtic. Pretty much Celtic seem to be settling into some variant of 4-2-3-1 around that.
Yeah.
Now, there was criticism that Warburton's plan B is try and play plan A harder. I don't know enough about Rangers. I mean, I don't even know half the team, the names of people in the Rangers team, so I can't really comment on it. All I can tell you is, before the game, I was listening to Radio Scotland where they were talking about how attacking Warburton had set Rangers up. And I sit in the North Stand. I remember turning to the guy next to me just before half-time and saying, see, for the last 15, 20 minutes, Kenny Miller has just acted like a man marker on Kieran Tierney. So talk me through the way both teams were set up and your thoughts on it.
I think the key thing if you're talking about Rangers is you have to go back to the kind of players that they brought in the summer. I think that every issue that they really have at the moment stems from that. And if you compare the game from sort of 10 days ago now to the one from April, you remember that game, Rangers just looked, especially in the midfield, they looked quicker, sharper, everything. They just looked like they were just, without necessarily having individual players that were better than Celtic, they just looked, like I said, quicker, sharper, maybe a bit fitter, anything like that. They obviously had some kind of tactical issues, but there wasn't much of a problem with it, particularly in the league they were in. But coming up, the thought process had to be, well, let's kind of address some of those issues, and they absolutely didn't do that. So a prime example would be at the kind of well-known weak spot for Rangers last season was at the centre of defence, and one of the biggest issues was they liked last season to press high, but they had a slow defence, and so they had to sit deep, the back four, and that just opened a lot of space to play in through the midfield. And even in the game against Celtic, you could see that Celtic were finding that space, and they maybe didn't create much in the way of chances through finding those spaces, but they were finding them nonetheless. And if teams can keep on doing that to you, then eventually you will get punished. Especially, for example, so last year we had Johansson in that sort of 10 role, and he found a lot of space in that game, whereas Rogic is a more sort of productive player when it comes to playing the sort of final pass. So for Rangers to not address that issue, they had to sit deep, but they seem to know that if we press Celtic high, then they might be able to play through us like they were able to even in the game in April. Yeah. So they sat deeper, and it just wasn't conducive to their whole game plan, which is to dominate possession. Basically, that's Warburton's philosophy, and that's what they're good at the end of the day. When they're in control of the match and in control of the ball, that's when they can do their kind of best work. And so, because of factors which all stemmed from their recruitment, basically, and I mentioned the centre-back position, but there was one or two other things. They were forced into a game plan that didn't really suit them in terms of defending deep. And when they did that, Celtic were easily able to just pin them in. And they never had, with the exception of Mackay and Windass, who at times each carried the ball quite well, they had no real counter-attacking threat. And so, especially, for the whole game, really, they were absolutely ineffectual. In an attacking sense, they had virtually nothing in the way of chances, with the exception of the goal, really. There was nothing. Mackay had a shot at the start of the second half. But, I mean, I can barely remember Rangers being up the pitch.
So what do you think? You mentioned the goal there. If we look at it from a Celtic perspective, because at 2-0, suddenly you could see the minute it went to two, you had Rangers players who were struggling to pass within 10 yards of another Rangers player, and suddenly we gave them a goal. So what went wrong from a Celtic's perspective on the Rangers goal?
I mean, I do think at times a goal can kind of, without any real problem, a goal can kind of just happen, one or two individual momentary lapses, and then all of a sudden a team's in a decent position. The one thing I would say is that, if I remember correctly, it's a while back now, was it Miller that was at the back post and got the header across? Yeah. And it seems to be a bit of a recurring theme that when the ball gets crossed in from that side and there's space for guys to, Lustig seems at times to be a bit far tucked in.
Yes.
Something that the one that springs to mind is Joe Berge at Celtic Park against Malmo. That's happened and on a couple other occasions. So maybe Lustig, that's a little bit of an issue, but I don't think the goal was representative of anything that was really happening in the game. It was just that even on a bad day, any team will get one or two chances to create something.
So overall, what did you make of the Celtic setup for that game? Obviously, there was a lot of talk beforehand about the fact that Griffiths was injured, and would Dembele be able to plug the gap and step up to the mark and fill the role of Griffiths, which he obviously did. So what was your thoughts on the Celtic setup?
I think for a start, Rangers' approach kind of played into Celtic's hands, so the kind of minor weaknesses that Celtic have got just now when you're playing domestic football weren't really challenged. So, for example, Sviatchenko and Toure aren't excellent at playing out and under pressure. Mm-hmm. So maybe Rangers could have had a bit more joy if they'd got a bit more pressure on the defence and maybe forced some more long balls. And I mean, Rangers did that a lot in the semi-final if we go back to that, and it was quite an easy game for two really average centre-backs at Rangers, but then because of the kind of issues that I spoke about before, they weren't able to do that. So Celtic were able to just basically dominate the game in Rangers half. Anytime they lost the ball, they did sort of react well and counter-press and get the ball back quite quickly. And so it was kind of just a constant pressure for huge spells of the game. And if Celtic are in that position, then ultimately they've got by far the most individual talent to take advantage of those situations, and they did. Tom Rogic, Sinclair, obviously Dembele, Forrest, these guys all found space in dangerous positions time and again. And so once you get into that situation, you generally find that the players will be able to create the chances and score.
One of the things about the game that came out of the game that's not really been mentioned that much was at the post-match press conference, Brendan Rodgers was asked about Armstrong, and he said, when I came to the club, we knew he played in a couple of positions. He played left, he played as a holding player, he played centrally, but we think that number 10's his best position. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do remember Rodgers saying that, and he did sort of expand on it, the fact that key to that strength of Armstrong in that position is how well he can press the game, and without a doubt that is one of the strengths Armstrong has got as a midfielder. If you compare him to someone like Rogic, and he's got nowhere near the creativity or the guile in that position, but he does have some fairly intelligent movement, and he presses the game well. He seems to understand well when to press, when to sort of sit in and cover his midfield. So I think, particularly for situations where maybe you need to just shore up the midfield a bit, then he's certainly a good option to have.
So we won that game pretty comfortably, and you talked about shore up the midfield, because just a couple of days later we went to Barcelona and were right royally thumped. So what's your thoughts on the way that Brendan set up the team in Spain?
I thought Celtic on that night looked like a team that were playing a system they had never really played before. They hadn't had a huge amount of time to practice it, and that the manager wasn't a specialist in setting up a team in that manner. It was poor. Obviously, you've got to appreciate the fact that a team like Barcelona, when you're Celtic, there's only so much your system can do to stop the kind of talent they've got and how effective their system is, on top of that individual quality. But Celtic were not well set up. There was a lot of space between the lines. It was a very flat, the 5-4-1, it was very flat. It was Dembele on his own, and then a flat 4, and then a flat 5. There was no... So Barcelona were easily able to stretch the lines apart and find the spaces in between, which obviously led to them. If you want to give Messi and Neymar and Rakitic and Suarez that kind of space, then you're gonna regret it.
I mean, one of the things that struck me, firstly in terms of the sort of general consensus amongst fans online and the media, was we were going to play with a 5 because we'd reverted to a 5 in the final 20 minutes in Israel, and it appeared to steady the ship. And so there was just an assumption that that's what we were going to do in Spain. We went to the 5, and then your other point about 2, there was one point, particularly in the second half, where our 5 were just basically standing in a line along the edge of the 18-yard box, and a metre, 2 metres max in front of them, our 4 were standing in a line right in front of them. And it just struck me that, getting back to your point, you're talking about between the lines and all this vertical, horizontal, blah, blah, blah. But it just struck me that the 4 were virtually sitting on top of the 5.
Yeah,
and afterwards I did read some people saying we might have been, because getting back to your point of, it was just a system the players weren't used to, and we might have been better playing something like 4-1-4-1 with somebody sitting to make the midfield 4 sit higher up the park slightly. Somebody sitting behind them, maybe McGregor, somebody with pace, with a bit of pace and a bit running in them, maybe not pace, someone with running in them to sit. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, certainly I do think that the back 5 wasn't the greatest of ideas. I don't think. The thing is that, of course, you've got the benefit of, you've got the back 5, you just cover that bit more space, and Barcelona, who use the width of the pitch so well, stretch you, then that does give you that bit more cover. But if you have a back 5 instead of a back 4, then it's one less player you've got in the next part of the pitch. So yeah, something like a 4-1-4-1, even a 4-4-1-1 if you like, a kind of front 2 that can at least put some semblance of pressure on the ball, either in the defence or even just as it comes into the midfield. But Dembele was so isolated that it was pretty much as well not being there, because Barcelona maybe had even 2 players that were easily past him. Once they got to 3, like I said, there's just no point in being there. So then you've got the 4, and it's not necessarily a hugely impressive defensive 4. Sinclair and Roberts are, for all intents and purposes, wingers. So you've got two central midfielders against the team that dominate the park, the middle of the park, even better than any other team in world football.
I mean, the other thing, so there's 3 players in particular that I want to ask you about. So first of all, Gamboa making his debut at right back or right wing back, whatever position. What were your thoughts on Gamboa?
It wasn't. I can't imagine that was the best night of his career at all. He looked very out of place. I mean, I can't imagine how hard it is for a guy to come in that situation. I'm sure they mentioned in the commentary he hadn't played for like 6 months, and that game is against Peterborough in the League Cup, and then all of a sudden he's thrown into the Nou Camp. So not an easy situation, but he didn't look impressive. But I'm not one to cast any judgments over a player on a game like that. His first game in as well. So as much as it was poor, I can't be too critical.
So the next player that I was getting very frustrated at, Beaton, who seemed to be enjoying watching Barcelona play football. That was my perception. Yeah,
quite passive, if you like. Not didn't track his runners very diligently at all. I think it's just a part of me thinks that it's just the type of player that he is. He's more suited to being in a team that's on the ball. He's technically good, can pass the ball well, helps the defence bring it out, but he's not by any stretch of the imagination, Victor Wanyama.
Yep.
So, despite the fact that they're both holding midfielders, they're entirely different players, and with that in mind, you can't. It's hard to be surprised that Beaton doesn't do the things well that we already know he doesn't do well. You know,
it was particularly the goal that Barcelona walked into the back of the net where he stopped. Messi ran past him. He started to run after him, then stopped. Then it was obvious Neymar was going to cut the ball back for Messi, ran again. Ball went to Messi, he stopped. Then Messi didn't hit it first time. So he started to run after him again, then Messi scored. In the space of 12 yards, he stopped and started about 3 times, and each time you thought, see if you'd have just kept going. You could have stopped his run. You could have intercepted the pass.
Yeah, because he's thinking as it goes, he's going, oh, this has passed me, I'm as well giving up, and then something happens and he goes, oh, maybe I could get this.
Do you know what it reminded me of? I remember a couple of times playing schoolboy football, my team getting thumped, and I'd be in goals. And, you know, we'd have 12 players or 10 players rather go and chase the ball into the corner, and the opposition would then cross it. And I would see someone starting to run back and then think, no, they're going to score. And I'd pull off the save, and the guy would stand there and go, oh, he saved it. And then the ball would bounce back out to somebody else who would then shoot, and I'd pull off another save. And you could see my teammate thinking, oh, he saved it again. And then it would bounce to somebody else, and I'd save it again. Then you see the teammate go, oh, he saved it 3 times in a row. Actually, maybe I'll come back and help him. Then he would start running back, and then the guy would score. And you think to yourself, see if you'd just done it in the first place, mate, instead of standing watching them, just assuming they were going to do it. And that's just what it felt like with Beaton. The final position is the goalkeeper. What were your thoughts on his performance in Spain? Catalonia, to avoid anybody criticising me for continuing saying Barcelona and Spain. Carry on.
I think, well, if we're talking specifically about Barcelona or more generally, because obviously...
Well, first of all, Barcelona, and then more generally.
Talking point. Yeah, I mean, you can always say, you know, should have done better with that goal. There's no doubt that maybe as a shot stopper, he's a bit short of the mark. If you're comparing him to Gordon just on that one aspect. Obviously, there are the kind of other facets to his game which are obviously important in the manager's decision. But I don't think there's much doubt, having looked at him obviously over an admittedly small number of games, that his shot stopping ability isn't quite as good as what we had before. If we're talking more generally, then it's quite an interesting point. I think the thing with the goalkeeper,
because I've read a lot of people, and obviously the comment people make is, look, he may be good with his feet, but first and foremost, you need a goalkeeper to stop shots, and let's put Gordon back in. I do find it interesting. Some of these people are the people who I was reading a couple of weeks ago saying Gordon's not up to the mark, we should just stick De Vries in goals, and thinking, well, you've not seen De Vries, you don't know if he's better than Gordon. And the attitude would be, well, I don't care. Let's just give him a go. Yeah,
it's. I think a bit of the Scott Allen syndrome. The guy that isn't playing is somehow blown out to be a much better player than maybe he is.
Yeah,
you know, if he's, you know, the guy who's not in the team isn't doing anything wrong while he's not in the team, and so people will go, well, he deserves a chance. The thing with and of course, like you say, people are saying, you know, first and foremost, a goalkeeper's job is to shortstop. But I think there is a kind of, because that's the kind of immediate, obvious effect that you see from a goalkeeper's ability is, oh, you know, a better keeper would have saved that shot. But if we're looking at the kind of trade-off, let's just say that De Vries is maybe a marginally weaker shot stopper, and traditional goalkeeping attributes marginally weaker than Gordon, say 10 to 20%, just for example. And maybe over the course of a season, that'll cost us something between 5 to 10 goals.
Yep.
You know, over the course of sort of 50 to 55 games. But what you don't really consider is that the effect defensively of having the keeper that's good with his feet is much, much harder to notice. Because, say for example, you get a situation where the defence or the goalkeeper's under pressure, and Gordon would instruct one of it, like if, let's say, he's in a tight situation, he would say to the defender, just clear it, or if he was under pressure, he would himself just clear it, whereas De Vries would maybe take a pass from a defender or make a risky pass, something like that. Then what you don't see is that, see if Gordon clears it long, and then, especially if you're looking at a game against Barcelona, Celtic will probably lose the ball 7, 8, 9 times out of 10. That if Gordon kicks it long and then 30 seconds later the ball goes in the net, very rarely, if ever, are people going to wind that back and go, you know, if we had a keeper who was strong over his feet, we wouldn't have had to punt the ball long there. We wouldn't have lost the ball, and that goal wouldn't have happened. So the fact that the shot-stopping thing is much more immediate means that people focus on that, but there is definitely a defensive effect, a positive defensive effect on having a goalkeeper who will keep the ball in tight situations, because there's more than, you know, there's 100 ways to defend, but one of the universal truths is that you can't concede if you have the ball.
Yep.
And so, you know, there is that benefit, but it is hard to see unless you're actively looking for it. Then you don't really notice things like that.
I was on a lesser podcast this week, and Remy on at By the Min podcast suggested that he understands the concept of, in the SPL, shot stopping is not as relevant, keeping the flow, keeping possession. It's more relevant under pressure in the Champions League. We need an excellent shot stopper. Maybe we should play one of them in the league, one of them in Champions League. What would your thoughts on that be?
I actually did listen to that, you know, despite the lesser quality as you mentioned, but it's still a good listen. And I was quite interested by that comment. I was thinking about it for a while, and there's definitely a logic to that, but it's equally plausible to make the opposite logic, that maybe the more important thing is to have the keeper who can play with his feet in Europe, because keeping the ball against Barcelona is the hardest thing, and the last thing you need is a keeper who's going to kick it away every time he's under any kind of pressure. Whereas in the SPL, teams generally don't put our defence under pressure, and so it's easy enough for the keeper to just, you know, simply pass it out to the defender, because the defender's not really under any pressure anyway. So, for example, in Sunday's game, Sunday, you know, time and again, De Vries was able to just out to Lustig, 10-yard pass, no pressure, and Lustig could just carry the ball up the pitch. Now, Gordon could do that just as well. So, as much as Remy's logic, you know, there's definitely a point to be made there, but I think it's equally as, you know, possible that the opposite would also make sense. There's a kind of argument for both.
The other thing I've noticed, and maybe it's just because the teams we were playing, but I felt in the last wee while teams were really pressing us high up the park when we were in a position that we looked like we were going to have to pass the ball to Gordon. And in the last couple of games, that seems to have stopped. So I do wonder whether you're encouraged by the fact that you know that if you're playing with a, you know, very wide two centre halves and they're wanting to pass, they don't have the pivot of a goalkeeper to create that triangle. So they're going to have to do flat passes across the back, and so the opposition push up more because they've got a greater chance of a mistake occurring. If they know that the keeper is an optional pivot in that triangle, then what's the point? Because they'll be able to play it to De Vries and he can cope with it. And so it actually gives you more time to play out from the back because the opposition aren't as keen to press because you've got an additional player who can play with his feet at the back?
Yeah, well, I mean, from the simple perspective of, that, like you say, that additional player, the kind of free man that you've got there by using the goalkeeper, if a defender's got the ball and you as a team know that he's not going to give it back to his goalkeeper, then you can press, and if you press, then you know that they're not going to play it back and then quickly switch out to the other side. So, for example, at the weekend, say Sviatchenko and Lustig. So Sviatchenko's got the ball and Inverness know that he won't play it back to the keeper, then they might be more inclined to press, because if they press and he quickly plays it back to De Vries can hit a first-time pass across to Lustig, and then Lustig's got the whole other side of the pitch, which is now more open because they've pressed high. Whereas with that option of the goalkeeper, teams maybe say, it's harder, we need to commit more towards pressing to cover all the options. And so, that's too risky. We'll just take a step back and defend when they try to move the ball into the midfield. So there's definitely a kind of another unobvious benefit there that teams will just sit off. And I think especially just now, where one of Celtic's biggest weaknesses is that when they were put under pressure at the back, they didn't look like they were, able to kind of resist the press, if you like, even on an individual or sort of group level. The movement wasn't excellent. We didn't have a player who can, like Van Dijk, without even the team being good, Van Dijk was able to be quite press resistant just because he was bigger, stronger and quicker, so he could just quickly shove the guy out of the way and run past them, basically. Whereas we don't really have that, and then as a collective, that's not there either. So maybe the benefit of teams having to take a step back because of what we just discussed is one that helps. And certainly, I mean, when you look at the games against Inverness, Rangers, Aberdeen, those games, the teams all sat deep, and Celtic were, I mean, even though they got a draw at the weekend, Celtic were thoroughly dominant in all three of those games.
So we'll move on to the Inverness game. It was one of those ones where it was one of those ones that sort of you talked earlier about Mark Warburton likes his teams to dominate the ball and dominate possession. It's one of the ones that seems to be showing just now that possession's not key to everything. Because Celtic completely dominated that second half. I mean, I jokingly said to someone, second half possession stats must have been 95%, 5% or something like that. And the 5% was every time their keeper touched it. So, yeah. What were your thoughts on Sunday about the fact that we didn't kill off the game and we drew?
I think it's just, I'm going to just put it down to one of those days, if you like. I think, really, that second half in particular, Celtic couldn't have done a whole lot more in terms of creating the opportunities to win the game. I think if you look at it from a kind of more statistical perspective, and there's guys that analyse the game in that way, and that was, they all had that down as one of the most dominant performances of the season, and in any game between any of the teams in the league, that was one of the most dominant performances, and not just in terms of possession, but the kind of chances that were created, and how good the chances were. Mm-hmm. That Celtic on, I think I figure that if anyone who follows, there's Seth and Matt, two guys that do a lot of the stats, and they both had it out that if they created those kind of chances, then Celtic would win that match about 90% of the time.
Yeah.
So if Celtic played like that this weekend against Kilmarnock, then you would expect a comfortable win, and a 2-2, from the chances that the teams had each, a 2-2 result was probably about as likely as Celtic winning 5-0. In terms of, probably on average, Celtic would maybe win 2-3-0. Mm-hmm. But 2-2 was, as unlikely as a 5-0 would have been. So I don't have huge complaints. Celtic weren't amazing. Inverness were, particularly in the second half, awful. just, I mean, I didn't see the game live, but I watched it back, and the second half was quite embarrassing, especially from a tactical point of view. It was just, very bad. But Celtic, like I said, created the chances, and that just happens in football, that sometimes you can dominate a game, create the chances, and the keeper just has a great day, or you hit the bar twice. So, yeah.
So it was just one of those days. Now, the only things, if we were going to scrutinise again, Gamboa encourages the guy to cut inside for their first goal.
Yeah.
So, and then De Vries gets a hand on it, but doesn't keep it out. Would you find fault with either of those two at the goal? The first goal?
I think you can partially put a bit of blame at each of their doors there. I think I'm not really sure why the player chose him inside. If you think Celtic are, not particularly weak, and in terms of headers or defending crosses, so to show the guy inside on his stronger foot when the outside option on his weaker foot, forcing him to the cross seems like the much more logical option. I don't know if it's maybe just he doesn't know the player, or they prepared for playing against a different player. I'm not really sure, but that did seem like a bit of a mistake. And then there is a case that probably the keeper can do better, though. I'm not sure if he maybe doesn't touch the ball, if he gets less stick. If he doesn't touch the ball at all, then people will say, it was just out of reach.
Mm-hmm.
I sort of thought that, but you should probably say it didn't look like it was going particularly directly into the corner, so you could probably say he should have done a bit better.
Okay, and then the second goal that they scored, from my perspective, the guy was given far too much time the ball rolled to him. He stopped it, and it wasn't, when I say controlled it, he took his time to tee it up, put the cross in, and then the guy got a header away. What are your thoughts on that? Yeah,
I mean, you can probably pick out a few individual errors if you look at that clip. Players that maybe should have done better with a header. Obviously, like you said, whoever was the closest at the time, maybe closing down that ball. But on the larger perspective of the game and even that second half, that's one of those things that happens when you dominate a half. You have all the chances, and then they go up the park and score one of the very few shots that they actually have in the second half.
So that was that. Two things coming up. First of all, getting back to the Barca game, what would you do differently? How would you set the team up? Who would you play for the? I know it's a few games away, but just because we've been talking about it patently didn't work as even a containment system. The 5-4-1 didn't work in Catalonia. What would you set up? What system would you play? Who would you play for the home Barca game?
The home Barca game?
Yeah.
Okay. It's hard to put me on the spot a bit. Well, definitely I wouldn't go with a 4-5-1. I think a back four makes the most sense. You can get more pressure on the ball in the middle of the park. You've got to have an extra midfielder in there. You can make a case, well, maybe for leaving out Roberts and bringing in someone like Armstrong. So perhaps Roberts and Gamboa out, go for a 4-4-1-1 or a 4-4-5-1 basically, and then you just have a bit more sort of defensive strength. You had maybe a McGregor in, Armstrong. Just trying to go through the squad here in my head. Definitely, those are options. I think key will be maybe moving Sinclair a bit more central so that Dembele, or if it's Griffiths on the night, has someone to actually pass to. Because I think that's important when you're defending against one of the best. When you're attacking against one of the best teams in the world, doing it all on your own is not easy. So I think that will be important. But there is an element of, you can only do so much, and then just kind of hope for the best, if you like.
And the other aspect of that is, do you see him sticking with De Vries long enough to be in that Barcelona game?
I think he will. I think he's set his, he's set his stall out with that. He spoke quite openly about when De Vries signed about the need to have a keeper that in his system that is comfortable with the ball at his feet. So I'll be interested to see if, as the way things are going, there's a bit of pressure building around that situation, and there could become a point where if it's a continuing theme for the next 3 games, maybe, then people, the media, the fans will start to be a bit of a pressurised situation, and whether he just ignores that and goes with what he thinks, or if he changes his mind because he just maybe thinks Gordon is the better option, or if he changes his mind because, there is a lot of pressure on that. That'd be quite an interesting sort of story to see how that goes.
So we're recording this pre-Alloa game, but by the time I get this out, we'll have played Alloa. So either there's a crisis at Celtic Park because we just lost to Alloa, or we've beaten Alloa through to League Cup semis. So I'm going to gloss over the Alloa match and look forward to Kilmarnock. So we get the Kilmarnock game at the weekend. What's your thoughts on what the team, how they're going to set up, and what's the prediction for the score?
I think I wouldn't be shocked to see roughly the same team that we saw at the weekend. Be interested to see what happens in defence. Obviously, Toure missed out the game. Simunovic came back into the squad. So that's obviously quite an interesting situation.
There's one. What's your thoughts? Do you think Simunovic was in because, Simunovic was in? Or do you think... Because I noticed on Saturday, was it Saturday? Or was it yesterday? Anyway, the development squad lost their first league game in umpty-dumpty months. And the 2 centre-halves were O'Connell and Boyata.
I did see that, yeah.
So I did wonder whether they've dropped down the pecking order and the back 4 will come from some combination of, in the next few World Cup, some combination of Sviatchenko, Toure, Lustig and Simonovic. What's your thoughts on that?
I would probably go along with that. I think certainly Boyata can join Ambrose in the kind of it's a matter of when they leave category. O'Connell obviously played early. Roger spoke really highly of him. I spoke really highly of him myself. Anyone who follows me will know that I'm a bit of a fan. But maybe it's just an age thing that he thinks that maybe with a bit of time O'Connell will develop into a better player. He sees a bit of immaturity in his play or something like that. But it could be that he just there's a glaring flaw that Roger sees. But for the time being, I do think it'll be Lustig on occasion, but for the most part, Simunovic, Sviatchenko, Toure that will make up the back 2. Interesting to see how that goes. I think Simunovic was quite good, I thought, when he came on, but obviously it's a short spell and against quite a poor opposition. Sviatchenko hasn't convinced as many people recently as he had done in the last season. I think Toure's, especially for the big games, his place is kind of nailed on. But yeah, I do think it'll be between those 3, and I think Lustig will probably revert to right back for most games.
Replacing Gamboa?
Yeah, I think he will. I think he will go with that. I think Gamboa is maybe more Rodgers type, but I think he would prefer to have Lustig in the team than not. And given the options he's got at centre-back, then he'll probably go with that, I think. Be interesting to see how that goes, though. I mean, I definitely wouldn't be shocked if Gamboa stayed in, but Lustig, I do think, will go back to right-back.
Okay, so what's your team for the Kilmarnock game, then?
I'll go with De Vries, Tierney, Lustig at right-back, Sviatchenko and Toure. Probably considering his home game, expecting to dominate, then I'll go with McGregor rather than Beaton. So McGregor alongside Brown, Roderick just in front, obviously Sinclair on the left. Not sure what the situation is with Griffiths, but if he's fit, I wouldn't, I would be maybe expect him to come in. I think for games like that, Griffiths is the better option over Dembele. I'd probably go with Dembele in Europe more, but in the kind of home league games, definitely Griffiths seems the option. And then I think I'd probably go with Forrest over Roberts. Just on form, I think Roberts was quite, he didn't do an awful lot at the weekend. I think Forrest has been good when he's played.
I thought there was an improvement on that side when Forrest came on for Roberts at the weekend. Yeah,
definitely. Perhaps just the opposition. Roberts played more into their hands, but than Forrest. Obviously, they're quite different players. But I think generally the form that we've seen from Forrest and Roberts hasn't, like I said, didn't really do a whole lot. So maybe we'll see. But I would imagine that whoever plays against Alloa, the other one will maybe play.
Do you think he'll stick with pretty much his system of the variant? I say a variant on 4-2-3-1 because obviously sometimes he sort of gets Lustig to tuck inside and Tierney gets to play further up and it turns more into a back three than a back four. Or do you think he might try and fight and accommodate in some of these games against the likes of, he did it with Motherwell in the League Cup and against the likes of Kilmarnock at Celtic Park, where he thinks a team's just going to sit in? Do you think he might try and fit the two strikers into a system? Or play both Griffiths and Dembele? Or do you think he'll just stick with it?
I think he'll probably just stick with it. I think you mentioned the kind of back three, but that seems to be less and less prevalent. You still see it in flashes, but as the weeks go by, it's becoming an increasingly conventional 4-2-3-1 that we're starting to see. Obviously, at the start, he was going with 4-3-3, then he morphed into that kind of 4-4-2/3-5-2 formation with the back three, come back four. But he seems to have found something that he's comfortable with a 4-2-3-1, which probably makes sense given the squad that's there just now. So, yeah, I would imagine he'll stick with that for the time being. Maybe when he brings in another few players, it'll change slightly.
Okay, and what's your prediction for the score?
I'll say 4-0.
4-0, very nice. So we're going to keep a clean sheet?
That's it. Yeah, as soon as you said that there, I was that's maybe a bit optimistic given the record so far. But yeah, I'll say our third clean sheet under Brendan Rodgers.
Excellent. Well, with that, I will say, Jack Lyons, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Cheers.
Cheers. So I hope you enjoyed that podcast. Now, I have a little confession to make on the podcast referrals. They are coming in thick and fast, and I have made podcast referrals, but in a disorganised fashion. I've just been lifting people's recommendations off their emails off tweets that have come in, and then stuck them up. But of course, lots of people are listening to the same podcast and sometimes referring podcasts that I've already made. I've lost track of what I've recommended and what I've not recommended. So, since it's a Twitter poll tonight about which is the best podcast, I'm going to do a bit of cheating and lift straight off the Twitter poll as to podcasts Celtic orientated that people are recommending. So there's obviously the longest running and actually the best, the CelticUnderground.net podcast. There is the 20-Minute Tim's podcast, which you can get on all of these you can get on iTunes. There is the 90-Minute Cynic podcast. There is the Boys Abroad podcast. There is the Celtic Rock and Roars podcast. There is the Homeboys podcast. And there is, of course, and I occasionally appear on it, and occasionally they appear on here. In fact, again, remiss of me, as a phrase I used with earlier in this podcast with young Jack, remiss of me, I should be getting Lawrence back on here. So the at Buy Them In Celtic podcast. So there's some Celtic podcasts for you to listen to, and of course there is the Club's own podcast in the Celtic View podcast. So that's podcast recommendations. Now, of course, we're through to the League Cup semi-final, and shockeroonie, the draw has been made, and I know we all thought that it would go one way, but just for a change, we have got the Diddy team left in the competition. So Aberdeen are playing Morton, and we play Scotland's newest club. There you go. Who'd have thunk it? Anyway, so that's podcast recommendations. That's the interviews that you had with Brendan Rodgers, and there'll be other interviews coming up. We also have the new music, which is running along in the background. The new music is by the Paisley Band. The label is Vodka and Lemonade was at the beginning of the podcast, and this is Copenhagen that's playing just now. What I'm going to do is fade out Copenhagen, have the interviews with James Forrest and Jack Ross, and then put Copenhagen, Vodka and Lemonade on again at the end. Hopefully that is everything from the podcast. You enjoyed what we do. If you've got any comments, want anything us to talk about, anybody would like us to try and interview, anything like that, just drop us an email at podcasts@celtigunderground.net. Always looking for new music. If you get it to us, we will stick it on. podcasts@celtigunderground.net. Anyway, that's enough from me. This is me, Harry Brady. That was him, Jack Lyons, and this is me saying good night and God bless. Good night.
No, we know quarter-final cup and their biggest game of the season, and we knew they were going to make it difficult, and credit to them, they've done that, but we kept going and we managed to get the goal and the breakthrough.
I think Craig was lucky to see on the first half.
No, I think the referees made the right call and just got on with it and we picked up from there.
Was it just a case of being patient and keeping your nerve?
Aye, no, definitely, but we had a lot of chances first half. We could have nearly scored in the first minute and the game might have been different, but credit to the boys, but we kept going and we kept going. We got in the next round, which is the most important thing.
James, in the semi-final now, every year there's always talk about possibly doing a treble. How much is it the boys' thoughts going into how well they have been playing at the start of the season?
No, we have started really well, and nobody really talked about that. It was obviously getting into Champions League was the first goal, and obviously this cup has came around quicker than normal. So as you said, we're in the semi-final, and we just need to get back onto the league form on Saturday and try and get another 3 points.
It'll be exciting to get Rangers in the next round.
Aye, obviously we should be getting the draw, and we'll take it for there and we'll give it our all and try and get into the final.
You think every other team will be fearing Celtic? You're the team to avoid it?
Aye, it's a one-off game. You never know. Teams will be thinking that as well. But we just need to go in with the right attitude, as we done tonight. We ended up getting the goal. We got a second goal, and we need to take that form on, and hopefully we can do well in the semi-final and get into the final.
So you were busier than a normal post-Alloa game.
Warmer as well.
How disappointed are you after that performance?
I think I always look at my players because I think they're the most important ones, and a great thing for me was by the time I got in the changing room they were already in and very, very quiet. They're hugely disappointed in that, I think, as a marker of where they are as a group this season. I've not been used to losing games, and although we were at the most difficult place in the country to come at the moment, it was still a quarter final. We still had an ambition to reach the semi-finals, and obviously they put an enormous amount into the game as well, and I think to hold Celtic for that length of time in the game with the form they're in, because I thought they played a lot of good stuff at times as well tonight. It was terrific and they deserved. I think in the fullness of time they'll look back at it with pride. At the moment there's still a real sense of disappointment amongst them. That'll pass and then we'll take a huge amount of positives from it, I think.
Jack, do you think Craig Gordon should have been sent off?
I got asked the question first before I'd seen it again, and at the time I was asking the question to the fourth official if it was a goal scoring opportunity. Was my question at the time, and he said he didn't think it was an obvious one, so that was fine. Having actually now seen the pictures, I would say that it would be, in terms of the actual foul itself, the type of foul it is. I think that if an outfield player makes that challenge, it's a red card. I think if one of my midfielders makes that in the middle of the park, it's as high as that, I think it's a red card. So having seen it now and looking at it simply as a dangerous challenge, I would think it should have been a red. However, what I would say to temper that is that we carried good fortune in that game at times. We did. Our goalkeeper played well, but equally we got breaks at important times in the games as well in terms of some of the chances Celtic missed. So I wouldn't complain about it. I think that these things kind of over the course of the game, I think we got breaks at times as well. But having seen it again, I don't think it was a great challenge. I'm a good friend of Craig's, so he thinks I'm telling it. Downstairs he thought I was saying it wasn't, but I'm up here saying it was. So. Yeah, I mean it could have been. I still think the game would have been difficult because of the players they have and the calibre they have. But yeah, I mean it could have been. And I think I always thought we would cause or be a threat in the final third because of the types of players we have. It was just the problem was having enough of the ball and getting high enough up the park to do it. And it's not easy. It's not by design. It's just not easy. So yeah, it could have been, but genuinely, it's not too big an issue for me because I would prefer to focus on the great deal of good things that we did in the game rather than that.
Jack, obviously a great team performance tonight, but Neil Parry's effort tonight, just a special mention for that.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you get asked in the build-up to these games, you recognise that your goalkeeper has to have a good game and a big game, and he did that very early. He did it, and that's key as well because my own experiences here as a player, if you do concede in that opening spell, it can be a very long 90 minutes, and he made some good saves early in the game. I'm not sure if any of them were highly spectacular, but I think he made a lot of good saves within it, and I thought his overall presence in the game dealing with set pieces was very good. I'm going to say this, but he's as good as you get at part-time football, in terms of his presence, his size, his stature and his goalkeeping ability. And again, he's another one that at the moment disappointed, but he'll reflect on this, whether it's in the months to come or whether it's when he's finished his career, look back on this night and reflect on how well he did.
Being a good friend of Craig Gordon, have you been keeping in touch with him in recent weeks just to try and be supportive?
Look, he's big enough and experienced enough to come through these periods. I think as a character to get back to, I spent a lot of time with Craig when he was, prior to him coming back from his injury when he was in at Dumbarton with Ian and I, and to get back to this level of football, having been through what he's been through, is remarkable. So I'm sure mentally he'll handle it no problem. Alright, cheers, thanks guys. Thank you. All the best.
Guess I got the wrong idea when you asked me to take your hand as you led me from the bar. But we never made it very far before I spun you round beneath the lights. Such a sight that I had to suggest we go outside. You said no, and an all too familiar tone, so you didn't have to say anymore. I know how the rest of the story goes, but it gets easier each time I'm told. And they say that, but I'm not sure that it's so. Selfless virtuoso, that's me. Not quite a saint, but how far could I be? Drunken waist and extended hair, I cafe, or maybe some corporate dice, cheap and nasty. I'd go anywhere that took your fancy, if it meant we could be the sugar-free Sid and Nancy. But that's not a fantasy that you share, even